G'day, Ancient Mahari here. Were you hooked in by a borderline? It's the promise of love that's like a drug. Now you're trying to survive the BPD relationship or the BPD relationship breakup or a little of both, or you're not sure? Borderline hooks you in, not consciously, but from the unconscious. It's the trauma bond dynamics in play immediately, unbeknownst to the person with BPD and the codependent. When you are being hooked in by a borderline, you don't know it, but it is the false promise of a quote love unquote that they don't have to give and they can't receive. The potential and the promise of love that isn't really love at all, but love like a drug that comes to those with codependency, whether they realize it or not, that they have codependency. This love, this promise of love like a drug, comes on to you, comes to you. You are hooked by it because you have a predisposition to needing to be heard and seen. This is the beginning, unconsciously for the person with BPD and in the unconscious of the person with codependency, of the trauma bond dynamics. Because these relationships where people with codependency become trauma bonded addiction cycles of intermittent reinforcement and a hell that feels impossible to escape as you lose more and more of yourself. A self that, unbeknownst to you, you didn't know as well as you thought you did, and a self that had this predisposition of vulnerability from the childhood woundedness that remained in your unconscious mind, repressed in an unconscious emotional landscape of pain and vulnerability and unmet needs that you had no idea about. That is the cause of codependency. Your inner child, like a different kind of shadow self, driving your motivation, driving the addiction, driving the trauma bond dynamics, while you, as an adult in your conscious awareness, have no idea of that. And you think you're actually trying to enable, rescue, fix somebody with BPD because that's going to make it all okay for you. But you can't do it. And even if you could, it wouldn't make it all okay for you. Hooked by a borderline because you were predisposed to be hooked by a borderline due to having codependency. As soon as the first mood or energy shift happens, the first devaluation, which might not be the major or the last by any means, as soon as that devaluation starts to happen and you start to wonder, what's going on with this person because, they're not exactly who I thought they were. And the more that gets entrenched and the more you experience and re-experience the trauma-bonded cycles of intermittent reinforcement, the person with BPD seemingly like they're back to who you thought they were. The more you are addicted, and that addiction to the potential of love, the drug of love, is then you, the person with codependency, chasing after, not believing, not knowing how to accept, suffering an incredible loss, but maybe not willing to even go there yet. So you continue in this addictive way to be addicted to the cycles of abuse of the borderline, the devaluation, the them not being who they were. Oh, maybe they are a little bit now, the good, the bad, the cognitive dissonance of it all. And this is what is so addicting about the trauma bond. This is what's so addicting because they're not really who you thought they were. And then you continue to want that drug of who you thought they were back. And that's where the addiction is super kicked in for people with codependency. And it goes back to family of origin, not only woundedness and inner child, etc., but loss. And you don't know what to do with this loss because it's ongoing and you don't want to give up and you don't understand the interplay. What's going on in your unconscious, in below your veil of consciousness, what's going on in your internal landscape, emotional landscape. So this only enhances the addiction to the potential of the drug when the borderline hooks you in of, quote, love, unquote. What do you need to understand about how you got hooked in by a borderline? And what does that really mean? Well, when somebody gets hooked in, it's like you're enjoying something so much that you're unable to stop having it or being with the person or doing it. And when people get hooked in by people with BPD, what's happening consciously is man is attracted to woman. Woman is attracted to man, right? And it's like, and then you start talking and wow. So it's sped up. It's super intense. There is a different feel about the way these relationships begin, but some people don't know anything about codependency or BPD, and not knowing anything about BPD and codependency doesn't mean that many people don't sort of feel something like a gut feeling that says, but there's something wrong here, or this feels too good to be true, or this seems too good to be true. Often one of the biggest hooks, people with BPD aren't doing this on purpose, by the way, but one of the biggest hooks is enjoying something so much that you're unable to stop it. That's being hooked. What's the biggest hook? Definitely that intensity, that hypersexuality, that they're idealizing you, and that they show up, in a sense, when you meet them, right? You come together on a conscious level of, wow, this feels great, etc. But what's going on in your unconscious mind, and more to the point, the unconscious internal emotional landscape? It's on a whole different level. It's like you might not know in the beginning, or you might not have known in the beginning of the relationship with the borderline, and you got hooked in, or you felt so hooked in, because to be hooked in implies like an addictive factor to something, that you're enjoying something so much that you're unable to stop it, or you know, feeling very strongly, can't really think really straight, feeling really strongly, hooked in, this is so wonderful, then you don't really pay attention to your gut instincts, or they're overridden by your emotions. And so it's an addictive kind of process in the beginning for people who are getting hooked in by the borderline because you have codependency, but you might have not known that in the beginning. And so the thing about that is, yes, you're attracted as a male or a female to a male or a female or the opposite, you know, whoever you're attracted to. That's what's going on consciously, right? But it's what's going on in your consciousness, that unknown factor of your internal emotional landscape, the wounded inner child, and the interplay of all these dynamics coming together right at the same time, but you're focused on the part that you're hooked in by the borderline because you're enjoying something so much you're unable to stop it. You can't think straight. It feels so great, and people override. Sometimes people say, I had this weird gut instinct. I had this feeling. Something was off. But you're hooked. It's like, quote, almost like immediate addiction. The intensity. And the fact that people with codependency, who may not know this, you have a voracious emotional hunger to be seen and be heard, and boom, here it is. You know, in the beginning, there it is. Idealization mirroring you. And people with BPD have codependency as well. So their codependency, they're people pleasing. Everything is about you are fantastic. And, you know, that along with the sex is just fantastic. So who isn't going to want to go there, right? It's like, wow, I've been waiting for this all my life, which might not be so much in the here and now of like the conscious, what you're aware of is happening, but the unconscious awareness of that wounded inner child. So people get hooked in by people with BPD, but people with BPD aren't doing that intentionally, because people with BPD have a whole lot going on, and they're unconscious. And in more to the point, they're unconscious emotional landscapes. And so this becomes that unhealthy bonded hook with those dynamics right in the beginning. And that's why I referred to this before as an unconscious setup. But the bottom line is, when you are hooked by the borderline, what you need to think about now And you might not have understood it all prior. What you need to think about now is that you got hooked into what you've been longing for, aside from the adult, the relating, and, physical intimacy, etc. You got hooked into, in an unconscious way, that ego boost, that hey, like, I see you, I think you're great, like, that people with codependency have maybe never even experienced once in their life before. In that sort of really intense and fast kind of relationship smacking together way. And that is, I would say, in an unconscious level, like, that's like a dream for a codependent, if only what it seems like in the beginning is what it really was, right? So this is how you get hooked in, and you need to understand that. And why is that important? Because if you understand that there was something consciously happening, but there was something in the unconscious happening, something happening deep within your emotional landscape that you didn't understand and you might still be trying to figure out, or maybe you haven't had therapy yet, maybe you just start a process for codependency recovery and healing from these relationships. So why do so many people with codependency get hooked by so many people with BPD? Hooked in, right? Because there is already this addictive factor for people with codependency of what you need and what you haven't got in your own life, emotionally speaking. And then once you get into it and you're off to the races, and for as long as the idealization and the honeymoon phase lasts, wow, I mean, that's a ride. That's fantastic. If only that was really the way it was. And that's why I also say these relationships are unconscious setups on both parties' part from the beginning. And then as they start, and you're hooked in by the borderline, right? But the borderline is also hooked in by you because of the dance of codependency. So with all the other moving pieces of this and people with BPD and what that means, but they have codependency too. This is where the codependent meets the codependent. But then there's also the borderline hypersexuality in many cases, but the intensity, everything to do with being attracted to someone that you want to date, get to know, and you want to have a relationship, you're looking to have a family, etc. Many people with codependency have love addiction, which is not to be confused with sex addiction, which I'm going to be talking about coming sometime soon. So getting hooked in by a person with BPD doesn't mean they did something intentionally to do that to you. More to the point, what people with codependency need to take responsibility for is, why were you that susceptible to needing to feel something that intensely, that strongly, and that incredibly wonderful, right? Like, everybody likes incredibly wonderful, but not when it's not really true, right? Not when it's not really going to last. So enjoying something so much, having a voracious hunger and need for something emotionally so much that you might not be consciously aware of, is the how you get hooked in, and so quickly. And so what can you do with that now when you're trying to survive the relationship or the relationship breakup? Well, it goes back to things I'm saying in other, audios, videos, and on my podcast. It's that you need to get into therapy to heal the codependency, family of origin work, inner child healing work. There are many other pieces to that healing and recovery process, along with finding more about yourself and the relationship recovery, and understanding the trauma bond dynamics that you got swept up into pretty much instantly. And why are people who don't realize they have codependency, might never have heard of borderline personality, this contributes, right? But you just get so hooked in so quickly. And the reason, and the how, that's the how really, I want to stay away from why. The how of it all is really because you are that susceptible based on childhood adverse experience to trauma. And so if you feel like you were hooked in by a borderline, just know they weren't doing it purposefully, consciously aware of what they were doing. And at some point, if that angers you right now, etc., that's fine. But at some point, you're going to have to radically accept that, because you need to shift the focus back to you, wherever you are in this journey, right? Wherever you are in this experience, people with codependency need to shift the focus back to themselves. Get into therapy, start doing that healing recovery work from codependency in the relationship. Or some people, I'm out here to work with you if I resonate with you, but some people start this process while they're still in the whole sort of like confusion and not knowing what's going on, and still in the relationship, or still wanting that person with BPD that ghosted them to come back, or trying to stealth reverse Hoover. I mean, people don't always have it all figured out, and I get lots of clients who come to me in that sort of like all confused, mixed up, but very painful place of having been hooked in to a relationship, to something that you so wanted forever in your life. No, not the actual adult part of it, and the wonderful sex and the idealization phase, but you wanted to be seen and heard and validated. And people with codependency need to work this out and understand where it's coming from inside, after the fact, after the too good to be true, the devaluation splits happen, which doesn't mean everybody with BPD ghosts and discards. Some people have to break up with people with BPD still, because they're not all the same. But this is how you got hooked in. This is why, and this is what's important to understand about how you were susceptible to that in the first place, and start focusing on what that means for what happened in your childhood and your family of origin, and what I'm always talking about. And the focus needs to shift from what the borderline did, or all of the things the borderline did, or did they do that to me on purpose, etc., to codependent personal responsibility taking. Not for what the borderline did, or any abuse, or any of that, but for the fact that this relationship that you are in still, or out of, or not sure, and you got hooked in by the borderline, you have a part in that. People with codependency have to look at their part. The more you focus on the borderline, the more you're increasing your own pain, your own rumination, and it means you're not done. And nobody just gets done, but you need to get into an active therapy process to be working your way through, and to be focusing, or learn how to focus on yourself more, to take care of yourself.